October 2019. In this newsletter, I repeated the seventh item on the list I gave you in the April 2017 newsletter. 7. When Jesus Christ was baptized by John and accepted the terms of the new covenant, he became corporate Israel, the heir of the promise. Therefore, when he died, he atoned for the sins of corporate Israel by suffering under the curses of the Mosaic covenant. But because of his obedience to the terms of the new covenant, God was obligated to fulfill the promise and resurrect him so that he could inherit what was promised to Adam and Eve, creation in the image and likeness of God. I have also explained these things in Not All Israel is Israel and in the pages of the Voice of Elijah newsletter and the Voice of Elijah update, over the past quarter of a century. I told you Satan has made a concerted effort to represent what I teach as replacement theology. The truth is, I have never, and will never, claim the church somehow replaced corporate Israel as the covenant people of God. That is not what happened. After Jeremiah and Ezekiel told corporate Israel that God planned to make a new covenant with the individual members of corporate Israel continued on as it had previously, but Jesus Christ became corporate Israel, when John the Baptist offered the individual members of corporate Israel a new covenant relationship to God and they were cut off from corporate Israel. But to understand how that happened, you need to be aware of the things I explained in Not All Israel is Israel. I summarize those things this way. 4. Under the terms of the law of Moses, an individual member of corporate Israel could be cut off from corporate Israel. Various parts of that law demanded that ultimate punishment. If the sons of Israel were aware that someone had violated one of those, they were expected to execute the individual and thereby erase his name from Israel. Even if they did not do that, God would cut him off from corporate Israel. That is, he would erase the individual's name from the census book of Israel that he maintained. For that reason God alone knew who had been cut off from corporate Israel, and no one else had the right to say anyone was still a member of corporate Israel. I have already explained these things in Not All Israel is Israel. I explained that, the truth is, Jesus Christ did not replace corporate Israel. The Jews lost their position in corporate Israel when God cut them off from corporate Israel, just as John the Baptist told them he was already in the process of doing. Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, and just as I explained in Not All Israel is Israel. I told you the very essence of John's ministry is summed up in Matthew chapter 3, verse 10. Where he parabolically depicts the individual members of corporate Israel as trees. I sarcastically stated that, if you were not aware that the prophets and apostles repeatedly used the parabolic image of a tree to depict a person, you obviously haven't paid all that much attention to what they say. I also told you Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 27. Is a good example of how Jesus used that parabolic image to weave the parabolic statements of the prophets into the parables he told. In it, he not only parabolically depicts men as trees, he also parabolically depicts himself and Satan as two houses, that will face the horror of events that are yet to come in our day. I told you Jesus is mocking the fools among us who have not a clue as to how he became not only the house of Judah, but also the house of Israel, when all the other Jews were cut off from those two houses. But his ridicule of such fools fairly drips with sarcasm when he parabolically depicts himself as the vine, that is corporate Israel in John chapter 15, verses 1 through 7. I warned you that if you are not familiar with what the prophets tell us about the Messiah who will become corporate Israel, what Jesus says in John chapter 15, verses 1 through 7, will elude you, so I showed you Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 30, to point it out for you. I also told you the parabolic image in which corporate Israel is depicted as a vineyard forms the basis for the parables recorded in Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 46, Mark chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, and Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 20. I said the part about God taking the vineyard away from the Jewish leaders and giving it to others should convince any rational person that something is going on that they don't understand, but it won't. I told you the truth is, anyone with a lick of common sense should be able to see that God changed things up a bit when he showed up here in this hellhole in which we live. But I warned you he did not plan to let corporate Israel off easy. He fully intended to make him pay, and pay dearly. I said that is exactly what he did when Jesus Christ, corporate Israel, hung on the cross, suffering in sheer agony. But I showed you that, in Jeremiah chapter 5 verses 1 through 14, the prophet Jeremiah tells us God imposed the curses of the old covenant on corporate Israel, because no one in corporate Israel even wanted to know the truth. I said that should be a warning to those who have no interest in knowing the truth regarding the things God has done, or even the things he is planning to do. Then I pointed out that, if you were watching, you saw that Jeremiah used the term bunch stems. I said a bunch stem is the stem on a grapevine that produces grapes. I told you Jeremiah is parabolically depicting corporate Israel as a vine, from which God is going to cut off those who have been a part of that vine. I said Ezekiel uses the same parabolic imagery in Ezekiel chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. And I told you a couple of chapters later, in Ezekiel chapter 17, verses 1 through 24, he presents a riddle that can be a bit difficult to understand, if one does not know the things I have written over the years in regard to corporate Israel, and also have insight into the fact that the prophets depict men as both trees and vines. The prophet gives you all of the clues you need to understand what he says, but you have to pay close attention to detail if you really want to understand the point of the riddle. I told you my point in showing you all those things was to make sure you understood the church did not replace corporate Israel. Instead, the Jews in the time of Christ were cut off from corporate Israel through the ministry of John the Baptist, until only one member of corporate Israel remained. He thereby became corporate Israel in and of himself. I told you the only good news in that message is, God cut off all the other Jews from corporate Israel before he made him endure the agony of death on a cross, and then sent him to hell to endure all the curses of the old covenant, in order to atone for the sins of all the other members of corporate Israel, both past and present. I also said the Jews in the time of Christ were given the opportunity to be grafted back into corporate Israel, just as the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans chapter 11. I pointed out the fact that he plainly states the case in regard to that reality, when he says the Jews have been cut off and have to be grafted into the tree that corporate Israel, Jesus Christ is, before they can participate in God's plan for that corporate body. I said anyone who has not been totally blinded by the lies of Satan should be able to understand that, when Paul uses the verbs translated, broken off and cut off, in Romans chapter 11, he is using the Hebrew idiom cut off from, to refer to the fact that God had cut off all the Jews save one, from corporate Israel, leaving Jesus as the remnant of the sons of Israel. Unfortunately, the truth regarding that is just as Jesus stated in John chapter 12, verses 20 through 50. The parabolic image in which Christ is the light of the living Word of God comes directly out of the Passover parable. It depicts the truth that God stated in Scriptures as a light that comes on when someone believes it. Then I said, to those who read the things I have written and choose not to believe them, I say the same thing that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15, verses 12 through 14, about those who chose not to believe the truth in his day. I told you the Apostle Paul used the same parabolic imagery to say the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. I told you the point is, there are some who can see the truth in what I teach, but others, the vast majority, do not have the ability to see because they have not been enlightened, as John says in John chapter 1, verses 9 through 13. Those are a few of the things I have already explained. Now I am going to tell you even more things you need to know, if you intend to avoid the delusion of the Antichrist.